Thank you all for coming to 600 Broad for our second community forum. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about homelessness, what that means in Augusta, what it means for the people downtown. I don't know a whole lot about homelessness, but I do know that it is an important thing to address when we're talking about revitalizing the urban core. I know that homeless people tend to congregate into denser, more populated areas, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because there are more services available to them. In terms of that revitalization component, it's the perception that people have that it's unsafe, and that gets into our whole issue of, there are places in downtown where we'd like to see more lighting. There are places in downtown where we'd like to see more police. And addressing the homelessness issue is one of those things about, we have to address the perception that downtown is a safe, wonderful place for people to spend their time. So again, thank you for coming out in the rain tonight on April Fool's Day. We've got this little microphone, and I'm just going to have it go around the circle, and if you could just introduce yourself and what organization you're here representing.
Keisha Anderson, Augusta Housing and Community Development and the COC for the homeless.
Can you tell me what the COC is?
Yes, it's the Continuum of Care for the Homeless. It is an organization of, a collaboration of organizations that service homeless individuals.
Okay, all right.
And I'm Linda Bars with CSRA EOA. We're the holder of the SSVF grant that serves homeless veterans. We also have homeless programs.
As a veteran, I can tell you I really enjoy acronyms. But having never heard any of those acronyms before, can I impose on you to just say the titles all the way out?
You can.
Thank you so much.
It is Supportive Services for Veteran Families.
Okay.
And it houses homeless veterans, and it keeps veterans who are at risk of losing their housing housed so they don't fall into homelessness. It's a really great program.
Sean Edwards, City of Augusta's Housing and Community Development Department. No letters.
Daniel Evans with the City of Augusta's Housing and Community Development Department, and also a member of the Continuum of Care, or COC.
There you go.
And I'm Vicki Johnson with Augusta's Housing and Community Development Department.
Just warming up. Yep. So with this being First Friday, we have our community forum happening here in the community room, but we also have a gallery opening happening out there. And there will be a band playing, but they don't start until 7:30, so we will have plenty of time before they get crazy. That being said, my role in tonight's forum is very different from my role in the last forum. In the last forum, we talked about transit, and I know a lot about transit, so I'm happy to talk about it for a long period of time. I don't know much about this issue. My role is more as a moderator, and there was some concern or maybe some thought that maybe there would be people here that were not able to maintain a civil tone and respect each other, as everybody at this table wants the same thing. They want the homelessness issue addressed. There are disagreements sometimes about what the best way to go forward is, or what should be the top priority, how money should be spent first. But as long as everybody can remember that we all are going towards the same goal, there shouldn't be any problems. That being said, if there are any problems, I will handle them judiciously. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Daniel because he's going to be talking a little bit about the tremendous work that Augusta Housing and Community Development's been doing, which I heard about from you. And the reason I'm disappointed about that is because it's such great news that I feel like everybody should know about it. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The department, Augusta Housing and Community Development, serves as sort of the lead agency for the local collaboration of homeless service providers. We are responsible for overall administration of the different programs that serve the homeless population, and also some of the data gathering, the information gathering that is done about our local homeless population. That's done principally through an annual survey count known as a point in time. We were very fortunate to partner with ARC this year to conduct the downtown portion of the count. And that's an attempt every year that we try and get a basic understanding of both the size and the demographic composition of our homeless population. In years past, we've looked at different models and methods for finding out better information about the nature of our homeless population, but we've always found that annual assessment is the most consistent tool to use to see the variations from year over year. Through the work of a lot of our partners in the community, nonprofit agencies like EOA and a few others, we have seen some improvement in the quality of services being delivered, and that's meted out in the results we see in our annual counts with small year-over-year decreases in our homeless population the last several years. More importantly, I think, is we do see some stability with folks that come through our partner agencies and receive services in addition to housing assistance, and an ability to maintain permanent housing to prevent a return to homelessness. The general consensus being that preventing the first onset or a recurrence of homelessness are the two most effective ways to go about trying to end homelessness in any community.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about that? Because you said a phrase that I think is really important, and that I've seen in the news a little bit because I read, and you said end homelessness. So there's been talk in the news about communities, and you probably know this better than I do, but I think maybe in Louisiana or New Orleans, and maybe Virginia, North Carolina, correct me if I'm wrong, but they've started talking about, we are going to end homelessness. And sometimes they'll scale that back and they'll say, we're going to end homelessness amongst a specific group of people. I think veterans is a common target because there's a lot of funding out there to address the problem, and because as far as public support, no one's gonna not back that movement. So when you talk about ending homelessness, what does that mean? For the person who's going through that process, does it mean that they're not sleeping on the streets anymore, or that they have housing security, or that they are, they've got a mortgage on a house? Do you know what I mean?
Sure. And there's a lot of different perceptions, I think, about what the term ending homelessness means. Obviously, the literal meaning would be that no one was homeless. To scale it back to more practical measures, typically what people refer to when they say they want to end homelessness in a community is they want to have a resource inventory available for folks who, from time to time throughout any given year, may experience some level of housing instability that could lead to homelessness. If those resources are there and available, that would prevent that person from having to access living on the streets or access an emergency shelter through what is called diversion or prevention. That is typically more understood, especially in sort of the professional circles that deal with social service and homelessness, as a meaning of ending homelessness. And the reason for that is there are certain folks that you'll encounter from time to time who won't choose to engage with service, and they don't consider their condition of living in an untypical environment as a problem. It's actually sometimes a preference for them for many various different reasons, sometimes related to past experiences. For some of our veteran population, that's especially true. It could be related to past traumatic experiences. It could be related to issues with authority or anything like that, in a wide range that includes certainly issues with mental health and different levels of psychological or emotional stability. So you're never going to be able to take assertive action to ensure that no one is choosing to live in an atypical situation, but your community should have resources available that folks who don't want to live in unconventional situations are not forced to. So that's closer to a definition. Anybody else wanted to chime in?
I was thinking, you were talking about New Orleans, and they're ending homeless with their veterans. They've reached something called functional zero. And functional zero doesn't mean that there are zero homeless veterans in New Orleans. It means that they know their names, they're engaged, and they're in some type of program to get them into housing. It doesn't mean that there are just no homeless veterans there. But the VA has come up with this thing where they have a name registry,
And I literally just participated in our rural counties. The VA wants to know the name of every homeless veteran. Name, phone number, contact. They want to engage those veterans and assist them in finding housing of some sort. And every veteran isn't going to be eligible or ready for the same type of housing, but to engage them and house them. And some cities have been very successful, and Augusta is very close to reaching functional zero for our veterans here in Richmond County. So we're real proud of that.
Do you think that Augusta, Richmond County has a higher population of veterans overall? It seems like there's a very large number of veterans in this community, not just the Fort Gordon presence, but Eisenhower Hospital, and there's the VA hospital. It seems like a real magnet for veterans in general.
It is.
And then of course that would also be nobody wants to have homeless veterans, but if you're going to have homeless veterans, you're going to have veterans first, right? So do you think that, is it significant? What I'm asking you is,
I think
is it
it is.
significant for us to be able to say?
Well, I think simply because we have a significant number of veterans. A census tracks that every year, and some communities I could tell you about the number that are in. I don't have it for Richmond County. Do you know it, Daniel? I don't, but it is a significant number of veterans, and there are homeless veterans. The nice thing about it is the VA is funnel money into Augusta to solve that problem. And their EOA, which is the organization that I work for, along with the Augusta Warrior Project, has outreach teams. They go out and they engage the veteran on the street. Their office hours aren't 9 to 5. They go into the shelters. They seek them, and they work in conjunction with our local VA hospital to make sure that that veteran is provided with appropriate housing services. This is somebody else.
So I guess my follow-up question then is how? How do you do this? How do you get to a functional zero, to use the term? How do you do that?
You're going to go to service, and I think that service class.
Well, quite simply, I think we could start that answer in a approach that is endorsed by the federal government under the Obama administration has redirected the efforts under the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to try and address homelessness on the broad spectrum, not just for veterans, through a housing first model. And what that means is it sounds a little intuitive when you hear it, but the first and best first step for solving homelessness for any person is to find them housing. And what that means is that it brings a certain level of stability that amplifies the success or the ability for the success of that person to be engaged through supportive services with some of the agencies in town. Basically, it rewinds the old approach, which was to try and build someone up to be successful in housing and then put them into housing. I think the data showed over the years that enough people were not able to achieve that level of stability and success in a chaotic environment like a shelter or sleeping on the streets at night. It compounded the difficulties they were experiencing and didn't allow any traction or gain to be experienced from where they started with their difficulty. So that's a large, in line with what our SSVF program does for our veteran population. It's where we're trying to migrate the majority of our social service providers that serve the non-veteran population. We do that through our department with some programs that are federally funded, like a rapid rehousing and homeless prevention program. We're encouraging, the partners that don't participate in those programs to look at opportunities to get people into housing placement as soon as possible, and then to wrap those services is sort of the term they use, to wrap services to keep that person successful and stable once they're in that housing.
And there's a federal strategic, There is a federal strategic plan called Opening Doors that Daniel is speaking of. And it basically lays out a roadmap for housing. How do you house these people? One of the interesting things about Housing First is the case managers used to decide when you were ready for housing, and they don't do that anymore. You house them, and from that housing, from that position of stability where you have a mailbox that people can send you letters, from that position of stability, then comes those services that help you stay stably housed. Try saying that 10 times. It's a model that HUD has blessed, I guess.
I think it's just a common sense approach. When you think of serving the need of the hungry, you feed them first. When you think of servicing the sick, you give them medicine. Then you teach them how to farm or how to prevent disease. But that's because you see those issues as conditions outside of the control of the individual. I think with homelessness, a lot of times the perception of the person comes into play, and that's guided the regulation. That some of this is decision making, and if I can change your decision making, then I can make you able or capable of being in a position to stay stable in the long term. But if you deal with the need first, the medication, the food, the housing, then I can build, as Daniel and Linda have stated, you can build those other services later. It's not about choice in some instances. Sometimes it is circumstantial as famine.
Okay, so essentially what we are trying to do here, we have a couple of different initiatives that we're trying to take on from a community's perspective to identify areas that in placing homeless persons, veterans or otherwise, into permanent housing in the community, we wanted to locate the areas of the community where it would make the most sense for those persons to locate based upon the availability of services, the access to public transportation, and the access to basic amenities like grocery stores and healthcare facilities, be they clinics, hospitals, or even pharmacies for ongoing medication needs. So what we've done is create a representation you'll see here of the dark colored lines represent our public transportation routes throughout the community. We've also identified some of our major social service providers, both from the nonprofit perspective as well as from the governmental perspective with agencies like Department of Family and Children Services, Social Security Administration, other places like that. And we've denoted as well the locations of the healthcare facilities in order to try and triangulate what portions of the community make the most sense and create the least amount of barriers or obstacles to success for clients that would be placed in potential properties in those different areas.
This doesn't represent every available service. This is not every church's effort. This is not every nonprofit's effort or membership organization that's going out and making a difference in the community, but it does identify some specifics that had to be put in place. As Daniel referenced, you have to have access to transportation to get to your services. Services include being able to get your medication, to be able to get to a hospital in the event of an emergency. So there are some specifically identified services that are needs for this population that we had to hit.
Is there any effort being made to kind of encourage those services to migrate into the city center, to migrate into locations that are that are more accessible?
Yeah. So I'll back that up a notch. Augusta, like a lot of basically urban-style communities, went through a period in the late 20th century of heavy disinvestment in its urban core. And so logically, you saw a lot of social service agencies because of available space, but also demand and need of the local population would filter into sort of those hollowed out urban core areas. So as you'll see, the purple dots on this map represent some of our identified partner agencies, and our concentration, the heaviest sort of concentration you'll see on the map, is in what is referred to as the downtown district of Augusta. There is currently not an effort to reconcentrate that or dissipate that. We think that agency location is not so much a strategic consideration as their ability to access the client that needs the service. So often in a housing first model, you're looking at some level, oftentimes of a mobility of service to a certain degree. Either, as Mr. Edwards referenced, the ability of the client to access through transportation routes the facility that the location is at, but a lot of times you'll see case managers in the field as well. Well, they'll actually go out and make contact with the person where they're living, because that's where you'll get a true assessment sometimes of how they're successfully stabilizing themselves, what level of progress they're making, and some of the obstacles they may have had to having a stable household. So I guess to wrap that answer up, no, there's not an effort to reconcentrate them in any sense. But I think with them having such a heavy concentration in one part of town, that does reemphasize the need to ensure the access to transportation for our client base that we serve in Augusta, because they're going to want to be able to get to mostly that downtown district to access some level of service. Because even while these represent largely the groups of nonprofit social service providers, the downtown district represents also a large portion of your mainstream or government resource centers as well, DFACS being your principal one.
Sure. I want to follow up on an issue you just brought up, because it's been something that I've been hearing from a lot of different people, from commissioners, from landowners, from investors in downtown. Everybody's talking about housing and how we need more of it. Most of the people that I'm hearing this from, though, they're not talking about housing for the homeless. They're just talking about housing, be it market rate, affordable, luxury, what have you. So I guess my first question then is, if the housing first model sort of requires, so the first thing requires housing. Okay. So with the number of people in Augusta that are that you define as homeless, do we have the housing stock to put those people in a bed, basically get them off the street, so that they're not homeless anymore, so that they can get that stability that you were talking about, which is the prerequisite really to find success in these other programs. So do we have the housing stock for that?
There's a yes answer and a no answer. So let's divide the table. Let's give the no, let's give the yes, because equally true. On the no, there's not housing available, because I cannot take any of the property that is abandoned, blighted, but in the name of another entity, and put that individual in it for their use or an agency that's going to provide services use without involving that private property land owner and possibly even purchasing the piece of property. So if I'm thinking about those individuals in that population who are the least of us, typically without the ability to pay rent, and more than likely not able to pay mortgage without some great degree of subsidized assistance, then I'm not in a position to provide that permanent housing without programs like AWP and SSVF, the housing department, EOA. It's almost impossible in order to take that person and achieve the housing first in, because we still are a community that understands that property has a price on it and it has to be acquired before it can be used.
So I guess we're the yes side of the table. I guess the yes answer to your question is that there are properties here, there are properties all over the county that are just kind of sitting vacant and sitting empty and being blighted and just being, I guess, not invested in. But as Sean was saying, we can't really take those properties. Now, the properties we do have, it takes funding to fix them up. And that's where another area comes in that hinders us from having the affordable housing that we need. It takes a considerable amount of funding to make sure we have extra beds, to make sure we have emergency shelters, to make sure we have houses where we can pull people off of the street, even if it's just for one night. It takes a tremendous amount of money that the city right now just does not have. The funding that we do have, it's funneled and is used very efficiently, in my opinion, with what we do offer. unfortunately, it's not enough to provide that housing first model that we all want so bad here. We do have partner agencies that work with landlords to try to get those rents down to an affordable amount. That again is very heavily subsidized. But that's the crux of it, is it takes money, and we don't have that to make that affordable housing come to fruition.
Well, I don't think anybody would look at housing and say that there should be some housing that's free. I think we all know that nothing's free, so, and that's not going to be any different. One thing I would want to ask you: are we talking about quality housing? Because I think some people would object to the idea of, well, we'll get them off the street, but we'll put them in this thing it's a death trap. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure you guys are also looking at it from the perspective of, we're not going to put somebody in a situation that's dangerous just because it keeps the rain off their head.
Well, we're federally required to make sure that their housing meets a certain standard. Okay. We can't just put them in any old thing that's sitting out there. It has to be livable.
Anytime we place a client into a house, that house is inspected because we use federal money. So we go into that house and there is a checklist, a habitability standard checklist. Does it have running water? Does it have toilets that flush? Is it safe? And basically, what we do, would you sleep there? Because if you wouldn't sleep there, you don't want anybody else to sleep there. And so we check off those habitability standards to make sure that we're keeping whoever we're serving in a place that is fit for human habitation.
And you say that's a federally published, a federally dictated standard of habitable. It makes me wonder, people who are not homeless, are they being afforded the same protection in terms of, I've lived in some rough parts of town, not in Augusta, but not in Augusta, but it makes me wonder. I know there are people out there who are working just as hard as they can to pay the rent in places that probably are not having the same, or may not be meeting the same level of stringent attention. I want to go back to what you were saying about the fact that there may be housing that is available but which can't be used because it's either not up to par, or it's in the hands of a property owner who either doesn't have the will to renovate or doesn't have the finances to renovate. Have you looked at all into programs that they're using in other parts of the country where they talk about receivership or conservatorship? I think in Georgia it's legally called receivership. The program in Baltimore has done some amazing things with moving vacant properties and getting them rehabilitated.
There are a tremendous number of opportunities for private property owners to do an equity share or a lease holdback to make that property that's not being utilized available, that a new funding source could be then brought in, be that sweat equity through volunteerism with a private partner bank covering a gap. There's a lot of creativity that could bring properties online, but there really has to be a desire from the owner's perspective and position to want to participate in creating opportunities for persons who need a hand up. And it's not a handout, but I think sometimes when we think about our assets, we think about them from a financial perspective. And the individuals in our community are human capital to where Augusta goes. It's the city's asset. So if a portion of that asset is in decline because they don't have basic needs met, and not just the population that's on the street, but the population you spoke to before that's not in quality housing, let alone affordable housing, depending upon their income, we're not looking at the whole of our population and saying, what does this group of people have to contribute to where this city's future is going? I think we look at the direct contributors as opposed to the whole group.
Okay. So let me ask you just a final question here for me. What what do we need to do? What's what is the next step towards, because it sounds like for the housing first model to work, we need to increase the number of houses that are available for us to satisfy that first check in the box, which is getting them in a house, right? So what do we need to do to get those houses renovated? Or to get, I mean, is it cheaper to build new houses? Or is it cheaper to, or is it more cost effective, I should say, to renovate these other properties, to bring properties up to par?
It's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah, I think we can work that one all the way around. I think
Let
we
me-
can work that one all the way around.
Let me start you with an easier question. How many houses do we need?
Okay, so our point in time count for 15, let's not use that number, let's use 14. What's our approximate? I'm sorry.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
the year-over-year estimate for the last 3 years has put us between about 500 and 600 identified homeless individuals. That's a combination of folks sleeping on the streets as well as occupying either emergency shelters or transitional housing, which are short-term, a little longer stay than an emergency shelter, but still a short-term, non-permanent solution for housing. So we're 500 to 600 is a good estimate for the community.
So if we had 650 houses, single bedroom apartments, just come available, then and make those accessible to the continuum of care, to just say, hey, get them off the streets. That's step one, and then you guys deal with the rest. 650 houses would do it. 650 residences.
It would depend. The demographics always vary from year to year in terms of household compositions. We often don't see, there is a slight majority of our population that is single adults, but you're still looking at about 35 to 45% that's going to be either a conjoined household or a family with children as well. Right, yeah. So that's a stark concern, and those are actually harder to serve in those models we mentioned earlier of emergency shelter and transitional housing. Anytime, just like anything, when you incorporate a child into the equation, your liability risks are different, your insurance and overhead costs go up. So really the best impact on the community would probably be to try to house as many of the families experiencing homelessness first, because servicing them through traditional means that we just discussed carry the highest cost burden to them. And so just adding units also would not necessarily be the solution, because you have to look at long-term sustainability. And one concern that a lot of larger communities have experienced for a long time that I think Augusta is encroaching upon is we are currently experiencing a certain era, if you will, of revitalization and redevelopment. And that naturally creates upward pressure on your rent scale. That has, just like in most of the rest of the country, not been matched with an increase in consumer purchasing power. Pay has stayed level for my entire lifetime almost, and rents continually go up. And as we see the possibility of a heavy redevelopment, especially in the urban core here in Augusta in the next 5 or so years, that could create a redefinition of what fair market rent was, which has a direct impact back on the ability of that person who's helped today to maintain their stability. If their purchasing power can't go up, but what they have to spend on their rent does, then you have a sustainability issue for any problems that you solve today.
Housing, homeless prevention, and all of that.
Just to kind of, I guess, a caveat to that, just creating a few units, the 600 units you're talking about, wouldn't necessarily help the issue, because there's also that population that you have to think about, that hidden homeless, that we don't know where they are, or they're doubled up in a parent's home or in an aunt's home or something like that, and they don't, they have too much pride to come out and say, hey, I need some assistance. So you have that population to think about as well when we're talking about creating enough affordable housing to get rid of the issue.
Well, I just wanted to get back to your question regarding, what's the next step in order to not necessarily come up with a solution for the 500 to 600 that we speak of, but one of the things that I really feel would be helpful in this process is more conversation such as this. I don't think our community is educated on the homeless issue. And oftentimes, there's a lack of concern because they don't know. It takes a whole lot more than local government and a handful of agencies to really put a dent in our homeless situation. So I strongly suggest educating our community, and I think we will see a change in the perception of homelessness, as well as more people coming to the table saying, what can I do?
I just wanted to add, a lot of the families that tend to fall into the homeless start off as something called rent burdened. HUD has said that if you pay over 30% of your income toward rent, that 30 is healthy. Anything over that is unhealthy. When we get clients in and we sit down with them and we do their budget, we're finding clients that are paying 60, 70, 80% of the family income. And these are working families. These aren't people that are out trying to work the system. These are working families. But they're paying that much just to maintain housing, and that's why they fall into homelessness. And so what we need in our community is not housing, it's affordable housing. Housing that they can afford to stay in and maintain. Just saying.
I want to follow that up because although I don't know a whole lot about homelessness, housing is one of my interest areas. And I think we had a conversation a while back when we talked about the creation of affordable housing vice the creation of market rate housing vice the creation of luxury housing. And we were talking specifically about someone from Atlanta made the comment that, you know, you name it, something like 75% of all of the residential units that have been added into Atlanta over the last 3 years were luxury units. And it's like, well, this doesn't help anybody. But by creating those luxury units, all those, you know, the fact of the matter is, the people who are making the most money in our society, they're never homeless. They never go out and think, well, none of these apartments are good enough for me, so I'm just gonna live on the street. They take whatever's available. So by creating stuff that gets them out of that mid-range apartment and moves them out of the way, then maybe that starts to decrease that upward pressure. I don't know if that works, but it does seem like, and you know, and again, not knowing a whole lot about the housing market, but markets in general, if you want your costs to go down, increasing your supply is an easy way to do it. So if we, you know, okay, if we added 600 units, that might not address this particular issue. But as a city, as a community, if we started adding a couple of thousand units, not into one little area, but you know, a couple of thousand units, that starts to relieve some of that pressure and bring the costs back down and create that long-term stability. But then, of course, you run into the issue, well, how do you make housing cheaper? Because, of course, as you increase the supply and the demand goes, well, the demand stays the same, the cost goes down, now the investor has less incentive to build the apartment to begin with.
You know, what you run into is exactly the paradigm you're getting away from. In order to be able to lower those costs with increased supply, you typically increase density. But when you're dealing with this population, dense numbers of low-income housing comprised is the model shift that Housing Authority has said does not work because they started it 30 years ago. When you're dealing with persons that can afford rent, that have gradual increases in income, regardless of how small, there are opportunities to take the pressure, as you said, off the middle, because they're looking for step-ups that work with their increased and improved lifestyle. But when you're dealing with persons that start with nothing, how does the investor, the private company, make the deal work when there's nothing coming in? grants can fill some gaps, agency support can fill some gaps, but at the end of the day, if we were going to create 600 units, what entity, other than the taxpayer, would bear the burden of rehabilitation, new construction, reconstruction, however you define it? Who's going to build the 600? Even through great efforts that happen here locally, even our agencies that have found creative ways to get volunteer labor and donated materials, even our habitats and our turn back the blocks and all of those entities, there's still some costs. And when you know there's no return, I can't pay a reduced mortgage even if you subsidize it. I can't pay rent even if it's cheap. Now build me something. And the answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sadly.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's sad or if it's just, that's the way capitalism works. Does the city of Augusta have any kind of requirements in terms of, if you're going to build 100 units, 10 of them have to be affordable, or 10 of them have to be subsidy available, or anything like that?
If federal funding goes into a development project, there is a prorated share requirement. I can't speak to planning and zoning's requirements for affordability when it comes to non-federally funded type projects. When there's new construction that's going on and it's all bank financing, I don't know if that requirement exists or not, but I do know coming out of our department, if our money goes into a deal, income requirements are set, rent limits are set. It's just federally required.
But that does get closer to examples of solutions to some of what we've discussed that have been seen in other communities. You look at what are sometimes called, I think, mixed income developments, where you'll have folks that are paying market rate, you'll have folks that are paying $1, but they're all in the same basic area. So you get that density, but you don't create that density of low-income housing that Mr. Edwards referred to that was proven to be an unsuccessful model over the last half of the 20th century. So that's sort of an area we'd like to see growth. I don't think we know that there's anything like that currently in place outside of federally funded initiatives. But that gets you closer to that perfect storm that you want, where you're still able to meet everyone's housing needs, but you don't start to create. The housing markets are interesting. People typically self-sort in certain manners anyways. If you just look at organically grown housing markets, you're going to see an anti-mixed income sort of paradigm. So that is sometimes where you see the need to create some level of public intervention, either be it governmental or otherwise, because truly your entire community is impacted most positively through sort of a mixture of density, where you don't have, all the orange block here and then the red block here. That does not create the diversity from an economic growth perspective that a true urban center needs. So getting into the models of mixed income, where we can see more sort of commingling, if you will, of people that can enjoy luxury housing, living right maybe down the block from somebody who's in a sub-market rate apartment or something like that.
To be honest, that's what every city looks like anyway. The reality is you don't know who's receiving a housing choice voucher to help them pay rent, or who owns their duplex and is choosing to have a tenant on the other side. When you walk down any major urban city street, you don't know the dynamic of what those communities look like. And that's the benefit of having real mixed income neighborhoods. What I live in should not be reflective of my station. And if it's not, then you can see opportunities in order to be able to create different types of housing that make sense. But even in our community, you see some smaller homes and some larger homes. You could have areas that may have $1 million properties 2 blocks away from areas that have low-income apartments. When you mix it correctly, you don't know what anyone's doing. You just know everybody's commingling and getting along. And so I think that would be a real ambition, to infuse more diversity in our design and creation of housing, that it complements the existing areas, as opposed to isolating or identifying a specific area that's going to have a very high luxury apartment or a very low income area. It needs to just flow into the community that already exists.
So it sounds like there are some policy options. It sounds like there are some financing needs, for sure. But I also want to turn back to what you were saying, that there's a need for people to talk. There's a need for people to come together. And I mean, I do have to point out the fact that this forum to address this issue, I know that there are more than 6 people in this city who are engaged every day addressing this issue. I want to thank you for educating me. It's been great for me. But what can we do to get more of that interaction between what I want to call your action group, your group of people that are doing this work, to have that interface with the community? Because I tell you what, for someone like me, I'm a property owner. I have a house and I have land and all that kind of stuff. And if you were to tell me that there's going to be a $10 tax on my land, on my house every year, a property tax, you're going to assess me $10, and that $10 is going to go into, helping to, take some corrective action on the market and build more housing. I'm okay with that, right? After having a conversation like this, when I understand what it is that's really being, because I understand it's not money that's just being thrown at a problem. It's money that's really addressing a very specific, not flaw in the market, but just a difficulty in the market system that we live in. These conversations, if they were had more frequently with homeowners and with property owners and business owners, maybe there would be more people who would be willing to stand up and say, I'm not going to spend 40 hours of my week fixing the homelessness problem. I'm glad that you are. And if I can chip in some way, in a way that is not, I don't want to give money to somebody who's panhandling on the street. I'm not going to do that. I want to know that, if I'm going to contribute, I want to know how it's going to be used and what the game plan is. And I feel like you guys have a great game plan. I wish we could see it communicated more broadly. So.
Well, I mean, agencies like ARC having conversations like this make a difference. I think this topic gets enough exposure from local government and the agencies that work in this arena, but for an organization that this isn't the template of what you do, to say that this is a conversation that needs to be had is important, because it comes from a different perspective. As you admitted earlier, you're not someone that works in this arena, you're not someone very familiar with this problem, but it's of interest to you because it impacts you. I think if more people took advantage of tonight's opportunity and future opportunities that are presented to have that necessary conversation, to be better educated about what our problem looks like. There are not 50 million homeless people here, but there are so many that we can't fix the problem in a day. But if we never start talking about it, we never fix the problem. So I know that we each thank you specifically and ARC for opening the door to have the conversation, to at least be able to say, well, let's start talking. Maybe we will find a problem that we then can fix and start working on this bigger issue.
Okay. All right. Well, that being said, it is a little after 7, and I have to cut this off. I personally like the idea of having short conversations that are focused like this, and I also like the idea of being surrounded by people that know what they're talking about, and then I just get to sit back and listen. It's awesome. It's fantastic.
You ask very insightful questions, and we appreciate that.
Well, I was listening, and again, it's like you said, it's a topic of interest, and I know that it impacts not just my community, but me personally. So I think maybe going forward, we'll look for ways to maybe try to put you and the folks that you're working with, is the continuum of care. Maybe we can look at finding some ways to put even just a panel like this of 5 people in front of a group of people to talk about this problem and to discuss, what needs to happen.
That would be awesome. That would be fabulous.
Okay. All right. Thanks for coming.